Good evening. I am Dr. Monica High. I am a high school science teacher and a recovering atelophobic. Don't know what that means? Well, essentially, it's a perfectionist. And the funny thing is a few years ago, I would have never admitted that I didn't know what that word meant. Because I was obsessed with being right, with always having the correct answer. And today, in my classroom, I actually teach my students to be comfortable in their errors, to not be afraid of failing. And it's really made a tremendous impact in their ability to learn. And I'm going to tell you about that, but first, let me give you a little bit of information about myself. So, as you know, I have a PhD, and sometimes I feel as though because I have a PhD, people expect me to have the answers, that I have to be right. And it actually goes back to my childhood, because see, growing up, I wasn't athletic, I can't sing, and I wasn't the most popular kid, but I was smart, and I knew it. And it was to the point that smart was not just an adjective used to describe me, but it was me. It was my identity. And that's something that I carried all through school into the beginning parts of my career. So I got my PhD in toxicology, which is the study of poisons. And because it's a STEM field, not surprisingly, I was the only Black person in my cohort. And while it wasn't surprising, it was still shocking, because you see, at 22 years old, that was the very first time I was in an environment where I was the only Black person. Now let me explain. See, I grew up in Charlotte, came up through CMS, which is pretty diverse. I lived in a predominantly Black neighborhood. I attended an all-Black church. I attended a historically Black college. So I was used to always seeing versions of myself reflected back at me. And I still remember speed walking across campus to find my orientation room and getting there only to realize that I was the only person that looked like me. And in that instant, I went from being just another graduate student to being the Black graduate student. I immediately felt like my performance was going to speak for my entire race. So I had to be twice as good, had to be twice as smart, and work twice as hard, because right or wrong, that's what was ingrained in me coming up. So I was so obsessed with looking smart that I was afraid to ask questions. Y'all, I sat in my graduate level science courses and didn't ask a single question. It got so bad that for the first time in my entire life, I was placed on academic probation. And that's something that I don't really talk about, because remember, I am smart. And if you take that away from me, then who am I? See, the funny thing is, to the outside world, I was doing my thing. I was a Black woman getting a PhD in a STEM field, but inside I was drowning in a world that I created for myself only because I was afraid to be wrong. So after grad school, I got my first big girl job working for a personal care product company as a toxicologist. And on my first day of work, we had a welcome breakfast, and I got to meet everyone in my department. And I quickly noticed that once again, I was the only Black person in my position. So once again, I immediately felt like my performance was going to speak for my entire race. I immediately felt like I had to be twice as good, had to work twice as hard, had to be twice as smart. So once again, I asked very few questions. And I remember during that time, my mantra to myself was, I'm smart, I can figure this out. And I would say that to myself every day at my desk. And that was my mantra right up until the day that it wasn't. See, on my first year there, I worked on this team that was developing these products that were going to revolutionize skincare. And before I get into that, I want to give you a little bit of information as to what happens to get you your products. So to develop personal care products, the very first thing that happens is, as a toxicologist, it was my job to review your raw ingredients in the finished products. So the very first thing that would happen was a chemist would bring an ingredient to me, and I would grant preliminary approval. To get preliminary approval, I would have to do just some light research, just to make sure that the structure and the chemical is not really too bad. Once preliminary approval is granted, the chemist can then go make products with that ingredient. In the meantime, I'm testing it, making sure that it's really safe. And then once they get final approval, then we test the products, and the products go out, and now you have your lotions. So I was working on this really, really, really high-impact project. And a chemist comes down to my desk one day, and he really wants approval for this raw ingredient because he needs to make formulas with it. And I remember he was standing right over my desk, and he was like, I need approval now, I need approval now. And I was nervous because I was new, and I wanted to make sure that I represented for the black girls, and I didn't want to seem incompetent. So I remember I hurriedly looked through the documents he gave me and granted him preliminary approval. He went on his way. I didn't really think anything else about it. Now let's fast forward a year, and I get a request for approval of a raw ingredient. And I see that this ingredient is being used in quite a few things that are getting ready to come out. And when I look at the structure of this compound, I was thinking, like, this structure looks pretty bad. It looks similar to some really dangerous compounds that are out there. So my first thought was, why on earth would they be using this ingredient? And my second thought was, who in the world approved this? So I go into the system to see who approved it, because I'm thinking I'm gonna have a talk to somebody, and I see that it was approved by none other than yours truly. So in that moment, I panicked, of course, and then I had to go to my boss and the chemist and admit that I had made a mistake. And as you could probably imagine, the fallout wasn't pretty. But I learned a lesson that day, that sometimes when you don't ask for help, that's when you really look stupid. Because of my fear, my company poured a lot of time and money into a project that was dead on day one. Now, surprisingly, I didn't get fired, and I stayed on with that company for a few more years before I decided to transition into a career of education. But because of my past experiences, I knew that I wanted to create a classroom that was a safe space for questions, misconceptions. Let me ask you guys a question. So how many of you have ever asked a question to your class only to be met with silence? Right. And it's not unique to students. It even happens in professional development workshops. But if I were to ask, who's the greatest entertainer of all time, over half of you have something to say. Well, why is that? It's about confidence. When you're confident about something, you're going to speak up about it. Because somewhere in our society, we have started to place value on the product, but we don't value the process and the critical thinking that it takes to get to that answer. That's why our students are afraid to speak up in class. It's why they hurriedly copy homework from each other before class. It's why they use math apps to cheat on tests. It's why probably some of you looked up the Wordle this morning because you didn't want to lose. So you may be thinking, okay, this sounds all great, but how do I get my students to do this? Well, I'm going to tell you. Oh, in case you were wondering, the greatest entertainer of all times is Beyonce. So the very first thing I do in my classroom is I encourage questioning. From day one, I encourage and praise questions. And it's gotten to the point where questioning is just part of my lesson. Students do it naturally. But once you encourage and questioning, then the scary thing's going to happen. Because inevitably, they're going to ask you a question that you do not know the answer to. And I remember when I first started teaching, I would do one of two things. The first thing I would do is I would just talk in circles to the point where they got confused and the question just disappeared. And then the other thing I would do, I would just say, I don't know, let's just Google it. And Googling is fine, but you have to remember our students grew up with technology. They know how to Google stuff. But do they know how to critically think to solve a problem? So now what I do is I model for them. I think aloud. I want them to see how I take concepts that I do understand and put them together to answer questions that I don't know the answers to. And this was scary for me to be vulnerable like this because I always thought that as a teacher, I was supposed to know all of the answers. And I thought that my students expected me to know the answers too. But I actually see the exact opposite, where my students respect me and respect the fact that I will admit that I don't know the answer to something. And then they actually model, they follow my model, and they can now critically think. I'll tell you how this kind of looks in my classroom. So now when I pose a question to my students, I just gather responses from around the room. I never say whether they're right or wrong. And because I wear a mask, I have like a mean poker face. They never know what I'm thinking. But I simply just ask each student to explain. Right or wrong, I just ask them to explain. And the cool thing is once one student explains their reasoning, another student will chime in and say, explain why they agree or disagree, and then another student will give their 2 cents. And before you know it, the entire classroom is engaged in this really powerful academic conversation, and I haven't had to do anything. And now what's actually happened is the focus has now moved from that first student that may have given an incorrect answer, and it's now focused on the critical thinking associated with arriving to that answer, and so now the stakes in my classroom are lowered. No one feels embarrassed to speak up because now they can participate in arriving at the correct answer with their peers. I'll tell you guys a story as to what happened the other day. So I teach AP Environmental Science, and in this class, I really stress critical thinking and conversations. And one day we were talking about urbanization, and I asked something along the lines of like, how does urbanization impact the environment? And one student, I'll just call him John. John is one of those students that has really great ideas, but he just has trouble focusing them. And so usually what he'll do is he'll raise his hand and he'll wave me over, and then he'll whisper the answer to me and expect me to say it out loud. So on this day, I was like, no, you need to say your answer out loud. And John took a deep breath, and then for 2 minutes, he proceeded to give the most incoherent response that was just peppered with all this appropriate unit vocabulary. And at that moment, I didn't know if I wanted to laugh, cry, or scream. But then a beautiful thing happened. So I had a student, her name is Sarah. Well, I'll just call her Sarah, that's not her name. But she is this student, bless her heart, everybody has one. She tries her best, but she just never quite knows what's happening in the classroom. And Sarah looks over at John and she says, I mean, I don't know what you're saying, but I think I know what you mean. And then she proceeds to give the most eloquent response using all of the vocabulary that John just threw out there. And it was in that moment that I realized that my students need each other in order to survive. Because you see, John couldn't see the destination, but he kind of had an idea of the general direction. And once he got it moving, Sarah was able to pick up where he left off and take the class to the destination. But if John would have been afraid to give what little bit he had, Sarah would have still been lost. And that's what learning should look like in our classrooms. It should be students working together. It should be half steps and missteps and misunderstandings and misconceptions. People learning from their error. So whether you are a teacher or a parent or an aunt or an uncle, or even if you just know a child, I ask that you encourage them to let go of their fear of failure, to encourage them to embrace error and look at it as an opportunity for learning. I encourage you to let's shed this thought of perfectionism, and let's start focusing on the critical thinking that's associated with learning. Let's all work together to create an amazing and impactful culture of error. Thank you.